right, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Michael Getz. I am the Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement in the Office of Engagement at the University of Virginia. I have the wonderful and really fun job of working with UVA clubs all across the country and all around the world, and fantastic UVA club leaders like Justin and Rebecca who have brought this event to you today. So thank you all for making time for this. Just a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. If you have a question for Shilpa during the program, if you could chat it to me, Michael Getz, via the chat box, then we will present those to her after the talk and the presentation. So feel free to use the chat box for that. And we might just ask, since there have been some people have different bandwidth, broadband issues, so we're going to encourage folks for the course of the talk and the presentation to consider keeping your video off, and that will help to preserve that a bit for everybody else. And then we can turn videos on after we do that portion of the presentation. And thanks so much for that. Just helps make it a little bit more seamless for our other attendees. So I am very pleased to introduce and say hello to my good friend and our club president for the Entertainment Club of Los Angeles, great member of the UVA Clubs Network, Justin Paxton, who will introduce Shilpa and lead the program from here. Justin, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. As Michael said, my name is Justin, and I'm the president of the UVA Club of Los Angeles, UVA Entertainment Club of Los Angeles, and the president of the UVA Club of Los Angeles, Joanna, is also on as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to give a brief intro and then pass it right off to Shilpa because she's got a really great conversation ready for us. So Shilpa is an assistant dean in the College of Arts and Sciences and an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies and American Studies at UVA. She's an author of Indian Accents, Brown Voice, and Racial Performance in American Television and Film, and is co-editor of Global Asian American Popular Cultures and East Main Street Asian American Popular Culture. Professor Davé researches and teaches about representations of race and gender in the media and popular culture, from superhero stories to animated narratives, as well as in American cultural narratives of immigration and border crossings, and comparative American studies, specializing in Asian American and South Asian American studies. Some of her classes at UVA, which many of you may have taken, include origin stories, racial borders in American film, action women, women and graphic narrative, Mad Max, Fury Road, a film studies primer, and Asian American media culture. Shilpa is joining us today from Charlottesville, and we are so lucky to have her. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shilpa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and thank you, Justin, for inviting me to talk on this really relevant and even more important topic in the time that we are living in. And I want to just start by sharing my screen, because what I'm going to do today is do a PowerPoint, but I'm also going to talk over it. And then afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions. There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of thinking about race and representation and the media in the times that we're living in. So today, what I'm going to really do is give you a little bit of background of sort of Hollywood history and race, and then talk about two issues that I think when we think about how we think about visual culture and race is something that we often overlook in the industry and even in the technique and the productions of how we see race on screen. So maybe give you a little bit different way of thinking about how race operates at different levels in the industry and in the production of what we see on screen. So I'm going to share my screen here, and this should work because we tested it. So here we go. And so are you all able to see that? Any thumbs up? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna start by sharing the slideshow then. Yay. And really just starting with thinking about a lot of times that we're spending on screen. So I'm titling this talk Screen Time, Race and Hollywood History. I was thinking of doing it as race, space, and Hollywood history, or race and light and color in Hollywood history. So if, and you'll see as we go along why this might come up. But I want to start with the good news, because we need some good news. And in the 2020 Emmy nominations that were announced last week, first of all, the HBO series, which if you have not watched, I highly recommend, is Watchmen, got 26 Emmy nominations for the one show. And if you can see sort of some of the producers, but also the different people who were in Watchmen, we do have a diverse group of actors, actresses, producers, directors, and writers in that particular show. And I think the show really reflects that. We also saw the nomination of multiple shows and actors in particular in different categories. There were 38 Black actors and actresses nominated this year. And shows such as Insecure, Blackish, and Pose, as well as many others, were recognized for the excellence on television. But there is a codicil. So we can celebrate the good news because we should. But there were no Latino, Latina, Latinx performers among the lead and supporting nominees this year. And in fact, not for the last 6 years. And yet they reflect 18% of the population. Asians and Asian Americans, who make up about 6% of the US population, have maybe 1% representation in the Emmy Awards. And from 2015 to 2019, white writers and directors make up 90% of the nominees. This year, 86%. So while we are seeing racial diversity make progress in front of the camera, especially among Black and African Americans, we're not seeing that same kind of progress being made for other racialized groups. And of course, what I don't have here is Native Americans. That's also and indigenous people. And we're not necessarily seeing it among the storytellers, the writers, and the directors. And that is how I sort of want to think about race in the modern era in Hollywood. And I want to start with a quote from John Berger, who wrote about art and art history and ways of seeing. And it's an older article. The relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. When we're thinking about racial representation and systemic racism within the industry of visual culture, I think this is a key thing to think about. What we know and what we see, and how does that play out on screen? And I want to go back to how we see the visual representations play out, but also the legacy of regulation upon the visual that has led us to seeing some people represented and others not. And it starts with a production code called the Hays Code. In 1930, the movie industry decided to self-regulate a code on their own industry rather than get the government involved. And essentially what this code did was it solidified Hollywood as a community, as a unified community that was centralized in California and was distinct from independent movie producers and movie studios. And what they pledged to do, and Joseph Breen was the mastermind of this, was to say, we want to regulate our own industry so that it becomes that we have a moral code. And this was before we had the regulations of films of PG-13 or R. This was the precursor to that. Because a lot of what the discussion around film that was happening at the time was, how do we regulate this new technology, this new industry? Now, film started in the 19 teens, and the first major blockbuster that was shown in the White House that many have talked about was Birth of a Nation, which really was a racist film that depicted the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And that was in 1915, and it was known as the first blockbuster of the movie industry. And from 1915 to 1930, there were all different kinds of developments in technology and in production, and different kinds of films. And there wasn't necessarily one place where all the film industry was located. But what we started to see after the crash was a real unification in Hollywood with different studios and studio owners. And also the power of film, especially in a Depression era, to bring people together and to create sort of unity around a particular kind of narrative. And what the production code did before the government could step in was to say, we will create our own morality code, because what they were really nervous about was having the visual of different kinds of actions, particularly women, and particularly showing interracial relationships is what they were nervous about. Violence was not as big a deal, even though you know, people were concerned about this at that time. I mean, this is when the temperance societies were coming. This was Prohibition. This was the Prohibition era. So the Hays Code that was instituted among all the Hollywood studios basically said, we are going to create a list of things that you can and cannot show on screen. And if you show these, your films will not be distributed or shown in our studios, effectively preventing the films from being shown. And the codes were related to this idea of what was vulgar. One of the key main stars that was objectionable to many people who supported Prohibition and supported morality codes was Mae West and her overt sexuality. They also were careful on the ways in which crime was shown, also what religions were being shown. Again, and you can see this is also the rise of different kinds of movements, including different hate movements that were happening at the time, and also against sexuality. So thinking about LGBTQ issues too as well. But one of the key codes was against miscegenation, the idea of showing sexual relationships between white and Black people was forbidden. And so what you got was the institution of minstrelsy, the institution of blackface, yellowface, and white people playing the roles of racial characters, because the stories were always there. And then there were main stories that did not feature white roles or white people, and yet they wanted to tell these stories, whether it be in the genre of the Western, whether it be in an award-winning novel like The Good Earth, which was set in China, whether it be stories of romance, including romance that might be across different classes or across different races. And so what Hollywood did is they instituted the idea that we don't stop telling the stories because people want to see the stories. We'll just change who we're casting in those stories. And so you see Al Jolson doing blackface in the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, which is really more the first musicals. But you see this going all the way up into 1961, where Mickey Rooney is shown here in Breakfast at Tiffany's doing Yellowface, where he's playing an Asian character, Chinese character, where he's putting, buck teeth and speaking in intelligible English or broken English. And so the legacy of the Hays Code, even though it stopped in 1968, was one that created the visuals that we see today. Since that time, we've seen different ways on which we can see roles that are visually rewritten. And so on television, and particularly in science fiction, you see, for instance, the role of Starbuck in Battlestar Galactica, which was played by a white man, Dirk Benedict, and then turned into a role by Asian woman, Grace Park. But you also see that when people do have the opportunities to rewrite roles, how do they do that? So I'm looking at, J.J. Abrams' remake of Star Trek. And this is an interesting photo because certain casting choices remain the same, and other ones, they keep what they were with the, but if there was an opportunity to change, they don't. So it sort of shows two different ways of thinking in the television and in the movie industry, what Rob Moore as producer did versus, what J.J. Abrams did or did not. And you see these kinds of representations on blackface, yellowface, start to continue even in a film like 2008, where Robert Downey Jr. put on blackface. And if anybody remembers the marketing campaign for this, he went around talking about how this was so revolutionary. Also note the date, 2008. This is right after the election of Barack Obama, where there was a moment where people were like, we've gone beyond older representations, so that maybe in a post-racial world, anybody can play anyone. Of course, what we get is the reemergence of blackface and brownface and other racialized stereotypes. We have made progress. Best Picture, 2016. Moonlight, one of the top grossing films of 2018, Black Panther, showing us visions of different kinds of Blackness and a vision of Afrofuturism. That's not just about comedy, that's not just stereotypes, but we're seeing different stories, different directors, different producers. In 2018, we get Roma, a vision of a Mexican family and Mexican director. And in 2019, we see a Korean film win Best Picture with a Korean director. And so we've seen progress where we're starting to see racialized groups deliver different kinds of stories, not only just in the United States, but from all over the world. And so this is sort of a shortened version of thinking about where we've been, the legacy of brownface and blackface and visual images, and also that there is change that's happening. Part of this is due to the ways in which we think about casting, where we have race bending or racial whitewashing, which are terms in which we think about how we cast different people. Race bending is when we have new media, and this is a chance to think about all the new platforms that we're working in now, not just in television, network television and in film, but also new media platforms. And how race bending, where we see we can change the race or ethnicity of a character. We get new versions of blackface and yellowface, but we also get new representations too. And also this idea of racial whitewashing that sometimes happens. It's another term for when a content producer might change the race or ethnicity of a character. Oftentimes it's to a white character. We particularly saw this in The Last Airbender, where all the characters were Asian, except, and then when they filmed the actual film, all the characters turned white except for the villain, which was played by Dev Patel. But I do go back to the good news. and this is a repeat of the slide I started with, is that we're making progress in 2020 in terms of visual representations. What we now need to think about is where do we go from here, and also thinking about how we can change more than just the visual, but how we can look at real structural change in the industry and in Hollywood. And one of the things to think about is, first of all, to look at public relations and to look at technologies of race, and how both of these are two arenas that we can work to change the way in which we think about racial diversity in the media. And so these are just two that I offer up, and I would be happy to talk about a lot of different other things we could think about too as well. So I'll start with publicity and public relations, and thinking about how we promote and how critics and journalists cover films and television shows and media outlets that promote diverse programming. And this is from Time's Up, which was started in 2018, a group to really look at sexual discrimination in the industry. And I went to a meeting that was talking about the ways in which we think about how diversity is covered in the industry. And they brought up this particular information, which I thought I would share with you. And that thinking about that 83% of the critics are white, 79% of the critics are male. And this is particularly in the film industry that we're looking at. 21% of the critics are female. 13% are underrepresented male critics, and 4% are underrepresented female critics. So if you think about this, the people who are telling us what we should go see and determining like how a particular film is set into the canon of what is film history are dominated by white male writers. And so one of the ways that we can think about how we get new stories being told about what's being offered is to look at the journalism and the critic industry and see who is being asked to write about, who is write about new programming that's coming out, who is being asked to publicize, who actors and actors go to when they want to publicize a film, who gets access to that. So part of this is an industry area of where we can think about public relations. Another area, which I think you'll find interesting, is thinking about technology. And this goes back to Richard Dyer, who's a cultural anthropologist who writes a lot about film. And he wrote an article called The Light of the World. And part of this was thinking not just about who's publicizing, but thinking about the actual technology of film, how film is made, and what that does when we're thinking about visualization, because then it's not just about actors and who is behind the camera, but how they're actually shown to the world. So one way to think about this in terms of technologies of film is to think about movie lighting and how we see systemic racism even in the way in which we think about how we teach someone to make a film. And it's even in the products that we use, in the camera lenses, in the way in which we think about cinematography or makeup or colorizing how people are situated on screen. So one of the things that he argues is that movie lighting privileges whiteness, white skin, and white characters, and really constructs this idea of whiteness. And part of the way he does this is by the way in which we see characters situated and who and how they're lit. So obviously Sean Connery, Wesley Snipes, and Rising Sun, you know, is thinking about movie posters. And so historically, one of the things that we can think about in lighting practices is that yellow and yellow tones were seen as problematic in early film. And part of that was because when you put or placed people of different hues next to each other, when film started to get colorized, it created a problem for the camera in terms of lighting and how people could be lit equally so that you could see their features. But as Dyer points out, and I reiterate, the solution was not to accept that there were color variations among individuals, but instead to use white makeup that required frequent reapplication so that you were trying to whiten or lighten everybody up. So what they came up with was the idea of backlighting that kept the performer separate from the background. But what it also did was it ensured that anyone who had lighter tones would glow, and it would create this image sort of I would say like an angel coming down, or this notion of the blonde bombshell when they were lighting women in particular. And if anyone knows the Madonna video Vogue, or the old Hollywood starlets of the 1930s, you could see when she says Rita Hayworth gave good face, even though Rita Hayworth was Latina. But the idea is that they used to, in the black and white photos in particular, talk about giving this glow to people that came from this notion of the relationship of color to whiteness. So in terms of the movie lighting racial logic, this is a scene from the 1967 movie In the Heat of the Night with Sidney Poitier. And you can see this is how backlighting works. If you notice, the lamp is behind him, and so that's the way that you can see Sidney Poitier, but he's still very, very dark, as opposed to, the other actor who you can see his features easily. You can even see on his face what he's looking like. But with Sidney Poitier, you can. And the actor whose name escapes me at the moment, but he won an Academy Award for this. He also played Judd in the film Oklahoma too, as well. You can see sort of the differential. That's how backlighting worked. But when you do this figure lighting, what you can do is you can see that each of the characters can be seen, but it's harder to see variation or differentiation among Sidney Poitier's performance. And so what happened was that the way in which the industry did it in terms of their practices on teaching how to light people, or how to take photos of different people, or do production shoots, photographing non-white people was seen as problematic. And if you were a non-white character, you were less visible. You would see their emotions or their faces less. And as a result, they're seen as less important or secondary to what the norm that was established was the white figure. And so what this led to, not only in terms of lighting standards, but you're creating a story with a visualization. You're teaching the technique of lighting to the apprentices coming after you, that this is how lighting is done, and this is who you should highlight in the film. And you're also looking at the development of makeup standards, not only in the industry, but also how that translates outside of the industry in terms of the cosmetic industry in general. So the legacy of how systemic racism works is all within this one technology. And there are a lot of other ways that you could look at the legacy of this too, as well. But people built their fortunes, companies built their fortunes on this. And to this day, we still are living with that. It's a lot better because we've had new technologies, but new technologies are still created from older technologies that privilege a certain kind of lighting and a certain kind of image. And so one of the things that Dyer points out is how this affects the aesthetics of realism, how this affects the aesthetics of beauty, and also, as I talked about before, the idea of how we teach others about the industry and the trade. And particularly what he talks about is the idea of how the common sense of media production is embedded or founded on, these racializing differences. And so I just picked a photographer, Annie Leibowitz, and looked at the ways in which we see someone playing with these ideas, but also how beauty can be recaptured depending upon as you start to recolorize your vision of the world. And so here you have Natalie Portman, in an essence, passing, being shown sort of in a 1920s kind of photo where she could racially pass. And then you have Meryl Streep's image of the 1981 Rolling Stone cover where she actually is wearing whiteface to show the idea of different kinds of hues in colorization. And so Annie Leibowitz was critiquing this practice. We see other ways in which portrait studios critique the images that we see of privileging whiteness. So Disney did sort of a photo shoot of asking different actors and actresses and Annie Leibowitz did this, of what they would like to be, sort of in the vein of Kehinde Wiley. And Queen Latifah said, I want to be portrayed as Ursula. I want to be portrayed as, a larger than life figure. In the presidential family portrait that we see of the Obamas from the White House, you can see in this that with the camera and the lighting, that all of them are different hues of blackness. And yet in this portrait, what we see is normalization of different people with different hues of blackness, where we can see their expression, we can see their eyes. And this is how you create anti-racist practices in the industry and in photography, is by showing these images and showing different kinds of hues. And so I think this is a really important way to think about how we look at industry practices, and start to not only think about who we're seeing on screen, but who is putting us on screen and the way in which we see this practiced. So I've talked a lot about different ways to think about race on television and on film. There is a lot that I haven't covered, but I did want to give you a different way to think about things. I'm happy to talk about anything from, the new archive or what Disney or HBO Max is not having on their, on their historical archive, the Gone with the Wind debacle, anything that you'd like. But I did want to give you a different way to think about things here. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you, Shilpa. I have some questions that were submitted during registration, so I can go ahead and start off a little bit of Q&A. One question is, what are some current examples of color in television that you think are good representations of the people, cultures they highlight? Are these shows normalizing non-white families and characters in a productive way, or is there still a lot of pushback against diversifying on-screen models of, say, the average American? And I'll put the question in the chat too.
Yeah. So I think that there are some really great shows. So One Day at a Time, which has had some pushback, but I think has also been sort of a remake of an old sitcom that looks at a Cuban-American family. I think is really great. Fresh Off the Boat is also another really great show that looks at Asian Americans in particular, and also has Asian American writers and directors coming from, and an executive producer. And I think I saw that, I think there's a writer from that show here, so that's awesome too, as well. I think there's shows like Dear White People that's done really well. Blackish is particularly good, and Blackish, in fact, even had, you know, they've done a lot, I think, in looking at generational issues too, as well. I think both Fresh Off the Boat and Blackish have done a really good job at thinking about the ways in which we think about generational issues related to race and representation too, as well. So those are some that, yeah, that come to mind very quickly. I thought Watchmen was fabulous, actually, in the ways at which it really sort of entered, you know, touchstone the legacy of history, how history does affect us, and how it reverberates through generations. And I think that's the key thread that ties some of these shows together, is that even as we move through time, there's a different relationship to the ways in which we think about race, but it has consequences. And that if we can talk across those generational differences, both within our communities and within racial communities, as well as without, I think that's where we can have really productive conversations. And also that's what we see in television shows that do it well. I'm sure there are a lot of other ones that people could share too, as well. There's now, this is the other thing, is that with the arrival of so many platforms like like YouTube, like Netflix, like Amazon, you know, which are subscription based. But what it's done is it's really allowed for the opening up of opportunities for people who may not have been able to get onto network television. And now it's become sort of the highlight that you want to get on these particular kinds of platforms because they allow you to do so much more. And so cable now is trying to come back and say, no, we have our own original programming too, as well. So TNT says, well, we're going to do our own original of Snowpiercer, you know, and that just won the Academy Award. And network television, I think, is trying to catch up, but they can do some dramas, but it's more difficult now, interestingly enough, for network television because there's so much. So the other thing is, how do you get heard through the noise too?
I have a couple more questions. Which streaming services are doing a good job in the diversity department, and which ones could improve?
Well, I think all of them could improve. But I do think those that have international subscriptions are really good. So Netflix, I think, has done a good job, partly because it's a global phenomenon. I think the hard thing, and those of you who have access to Netflix from other countries will know this, is that there's different programming for different regions of the world. And if you're in another part of the world and you're able to watch their access, some of the shows they get are fantastic, but we can't get them in the United States. So part of that is thinking about, when we're talking about structural change, is, do we have access to other types of shows that can show us a broader vision of the world? Just recently, many of you may have seen in, is that what networks have, or what the streaming platforms have tried to do in support of Black Lives Matters, but also in support of, you know, the post George Floyd era, is to actually have programming that is around the Black experience. And so there are categories. Before it used to be a month. And when I used to watch, it'd be like celebrate, you know, Hispanic Heritage Month, and then they would have different shows in September, or in May it would be Asian Pacific Heritage Month, or in February it'd be, you know, African American Heritage Month. But now there are all, you know, there are, every time you watch, you can see different kinds of shows. So that makes sometimes it easier to find, so you don't have to go searching for it too, as well.
Great. What classes do you recommend students take to really be prepared for the entertainment industry after college? Are there any extracurriculars you recommend for students looking to go into a career in the performing arts?
Well, I think every student should take a class in domestic diversity or race relations, especially in the US. I think that is key, because I think no matter who you are, this is the reality that we live in, and the ability to adopt or see things from a different perspective will take you very far, no matter what industry you're in. But particularly, I think, in the entertainment industry. I would also, if I was going into the entertainment industry, tell people that they should, if they can, take a class, of course, in media studies or American studies, right? But also, I think it's important to take something maybe in public speaking. You could do this through drama. Even if you're not going to become an actor, part of that is how we express ourselves becomes very important. So I think that would be a great way. And then also maybe to take a class in ethics, to think about the politics of ethics and how that influences the way in which we think about the decisions that we make. If you take a class in, you know, economics, that's great to look at sort of the economic realities too, or art history, but I would say any of those would work really well. And I would also recommend for people who want to do extracurricular kinds of areas, if at UVA, there are a ton of ways to do this. One key way is to volunteer for the Virginia Film Festival, which is a way to meet writers and directors and people in the industry. You could also, you know, work with there's different filmmaking programs, there's internships. You can make your own videos. So even smaller companies or even departments sometimes need help with their web help. So anything thinking about how you're looking at, you know, production becomes important. But with your iPhone now, you can go and shoot your own video, which is so great. And then I think, you know, history becomes really important. But looking at production, there's also, you know, sociology classes become good, all sorts of other kinds of ways.
Thank you. The next question is, what do you think would be a good standard in making sure a television show writer's room is diverse? 50% underrepresented groups and underrepresented executive producer?
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, if you start putting numbers on things, it becomes difficult, just because you have to worry about being the token person, right? Or I would say if you're going to bring in writers of color or people from different groups or other underrepresented groups in terms of sexual orientation or disability too, is if you can have more than one. I'm thinking of the Highlander, there can be only one, right? Quote. And I want to say there should be more than one, because it's a lot of a burden to put on one person. And I always worry about tokenism. It's a lot of pressure. If you can get, you know, people who can offer different perspectives, I think that would be, and it's, you know, if you have if you have someone who's Black, who's Asian, and who's Latino in the room, it's still one of each, right? And and so that becomes difficult. Can't you have more than one to have people bring different perspectives, right? And so we always have to be aware of numbers. You want to get the best people who bring a different perspective, and you also want to have people who can see other people's perspective. So it's not just the way that you look that determines your perspective. But I would say at least operate on the buddy system and have two people who can support each other, because it's hard. It's a really difficult job to ask. People go into the industry and they go into the writing room because they love it, but it is hard to as well, constantly having to face the questions of being the one. So you want to have people who can support each other and also have a supportive environment of people who they can go to outside of that, outside of their room. Yeah.
Next question is, there have been a lot of great movies and shows like Fresh Off the Boat, The Farewell, Crazy Rich Asians, and that sort of been highlighting generational differences and the intersection of that with being a first or second generation American. But there have been some new shows, especially around the South Asian experience, such as Never Have I Ever, Mindy Kaling's new show, or the new Netflix documentary series, Indian Matchmaking, which kind of focuses on specific parts of the Asian experience. Is there a risk of those not getting in the target audience, thinking those shows represent the entire culture, or a risk of those in the target audience feeling that because of these shows, they need to hire or whitewash their culture, for lack of a better term? Or is this kind of representation still considered progress?
Okay. Can you post that question? That has multiple parts. Okay. So one of the things I would say is that when you're looking that there have been different kinds of shows, they're all different genres too, as well. So Fresh Off the Boat is a sitcom, right? Never Have I Ever is also, it's a teen drama, which has its own teen angst that you're going into it, as well as also thinking about it as as sort of a comic element to it. The Farewell is a drama, which is, such a lovely film. Because, you know, it's Awkwafina should have gotten the Oscar. Sorry. But anyways, I would say that's a lovely film, and it's a drama, and that really sort of breaks down these issues of the way in which we think about what is Asian and Asian American, and also the ways in which we think about what is cultural. Like, some people might see that film as, this is a Chinese thing, or but there's differences between mainland China and Taiwan, and the ways in which we think about generational differences, and something that might be considered cultural is in fact just a family story that you can't necessarily put onto one particular area. So what I would look is that they are about the sort of either the Asian American or the South Asian experience, but they're different kinds of genres. Is there a risk that people are going to take them in one way? Yes, right? There's been a lot of talk about the Indian matchmaking, and I've written on arranged marriage. 10 years ago, I've actually written on an arranged marriage convention. 15 years ago. So this is sort of interesting that it's coming up. That show, particularly in the South Asian community, has brought up a lot of angst. And part of that is, if you think about Real Housewives, or you think about The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, it's in that vein that I think you want to look at this show, is that it's there because it is over the top. Are there some issues, or are there some types of attitudes that you see that you may not have seen in the South Asian diaspora before on screen? Oh yes. But for those of us who are in the South Asian diaspora, when we hear about colorism or, you know, caste, we've heard that. I've heard that my whole life. That's part of that too, as well. And so why not show that every culture has different kinds of issues that it's dealing with? You know, colorism is an issue that goes across all the cultures. And as I just showed you and talked about, a lot of that has to do with lighting and, you know, in the makeup industry. So when you think about the whitening creams or you think about colorism across the world, part of this is really, it's the legacy of the ways in which we visually see people. And so how do we get beyond that? Because we have grown up with it, we're steeped in it. So part of that is to start pointing out these practices. Is any kind of representation progress? That is, I think, up to those who are watching it. If you continue to see the same thing over and over again, then it becomes stereotypical. If, you know, you go into to pitch a show and they're like, well, I want the next Never Have I Ever, right? And I only want to show teen dramas that feature South Asian American girls in this way, then I think that's a problem, right? But what I love about all of these examples is they're all different. They're all about a different aspect of, you know, the Asian American experience. And so I think that is progress because we're seeing different angles and different perspectives.
All right, we've got time for maybe one more question and then we'll have to wrap it up, unfortunately. So do you think we'll experience a new wave of performative racial justice supporters? And how can we work to hold executives in power like these accountable for more responsible and equal representation in the media that we consume?
That's an excellent question. Yes, I do. I think we are going to see a renaissance, actually, of performative justice performances. And I think we should do everything in our power to encourage the voices that are going to come out of this. We saw this a little bit in the 90s when, you know, and Spike Lee and Ang Lee and Mira Nair as film directors came out of that movement. We saw it in the 60s with the Black Arts movement. And so we've seen this before. So how do we best support that? And part of that is to give people the space, the time, and most of all the money, right? To be able to develop these ideas. And I think we can do it at multiple levels. It doesn't just have to be the industry, but I think the industry creating opportunities is important, especially in the economy that we're in, where you pay people to learn and in all different areas. And I know everybody wants to be a writer or a director, but it can be really great to be an editor or a sound designer. As people may know from my work, I think sound is very important, especially the idea of vocal accents and music. So those are different areas, but lighting, there are so many different ways that we can do this. The other thing is I would say is to support the independent film festivals too, as well, because that is where a lot of great stuff is coming out. But I think like we need to have more, what I would like to see at the university level is where we have more artists in residence. And so that we bring artists to the university for, you know, maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks stint and have them meet with students so that they can sort of, it could be like a masterclass, but we could, you know, teach workshops on everything from screenwriting to make connections. I think that would be a terrific program. I would love to, actually, if someone from UVA is listening, I would love to talk to you more about doing something like this, because I think that's the best way is to have people meet. And even in this virtual environment that we're at, we can do that too, as well, where we can have smaller groups meet with different people to talk from across the world now.
That's great. Shilpa, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a really great conversation.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me, Justin. And if anyone has questions, please let me know. Please feel free to email me. Thanks so
Great.
much.
And we will do, this is being recorded and we will post it on the UVA, I believe it's the UVA Club YouTube channel. And then I will also try and make sure that we get that link posted on UVA Entertainment Club's Facebook page. So thanks again, everyone, for coming out. I really appreciate it.